"Mommy didn't come home last night?" little girl cried. Minutes later, 100 Hell's Angel showed up. The morning sun struggled to pierce through heavy snow clouds, casting a gray pallor over Pine Street. Snowflakes drifted down silently, coating the already white ground with fresh powder. The quiet neighborhood, usually filled with the sounds of children playing and cars heading to work, seemed muted under winter's blanket. In front of a weathered house with peeling blue paint and crooked shutters, little Maggie Collins stood in the doorway. She wore pink pajamas with unicorns on them, her tiny feet bare against the wooden floor. Her brown curls were messy from sleep, and her big green eyes stared out at the empty street. The stuffed bear in her arms, worn from years of love, missing one eye and patched in several places, was clutched tightly to her chest. Her small fingers gripped its matted fur as if it was her only anchor to the world. "Mommy didn't come home last night," she whispered, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. The words hung there, mixing with the falling snow. She repeated them again, softer this time, as if saying them might make her mother appear. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. The house behind her was dark and still. Through the open door, dishes from yesterday's dinner still sat in the sink. A blanket lay crumpled on the couch where Maggie had fallen asleep, waiting. The old wall clock ticked steadily, marking time in a house that felt frozen. Maggie shifted from one foot to the other, the cold seeping through her pajamas. Her toes were turning pink, but she didn't move from her post. She'd been standing there since she woke up, watching and waiting, just like Mommy had told her to do if anything ever happened. "Mommy didn't come home last night," she said again, her voice trembling slightly. A tear rolled down her cheek, quickly wiped away by her bear's fuzzy ear. The rumble of a motorcycle broke through the morning silence. It grew louder, then cut off suddenly. Parked by the curb, a large black motorcycle gleamed despite the falling snow. Its rider, Johnny Bear Daniels, stood up from the bike, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the white ground. Johnny's leather jacket was dusted with snow, his thick beard catching snowflakes as he walked toward the house. The tattoos on his hands stood out starkly against his pale skin in the winter light. His heavy boots crunched in the fresh snow as he approached. When he saw Maggie standing there in her pajamas, something shifted in his stern expression. The hardness in his eyes softened, and his steps slowed. Here was this tiny girl, alone and cold, looking up at him with those big green eyes full of trust and worry. Johnny knelt down in the snow, bringing himself to her level. His massive frame seemed to shrink as he tried to make himself less intimidating. Despite his rough appearance, the tattoos, the leather, the typical tough guy exterior, his voice came out gentle and warm. "Hey there, little one," he said softly. "What's wrong? Where's your mama?" Maggie clutched her bear tighter, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Mommy didn't come home last night," she said, her voice small but clear. "She said she was going out with friends, but she always comes back to tuck me in." Fresh tears welled up in her eyes. "I waited and waited, but she didn't come home." Johnny's weathered face creased with concern as he listened to the little girl's words. The falling snow continued to gather on his shoulders as he stayed perfectly still, giving Maggie his complete attention. Johnny reached out with gentle hands, carefully lifting Maggie from the doorway. Her small body shivered against his leather jacket as he cradled her close, trying to share his warmth. The stuffed bear remained squeezed between them, a silent witness to this unlikely moment of tenderness. "Let's get you inside first, sweetheart," Johnny said, his gruff voice softening. "Then we're gonna find your mommy." He stepped into the house, kicking the door closed behind him to keep out the cold. The living room told its own story. A half-empty cup of cold coffee on the side table, Rita's worn jacket draped over a chair, and Maggie's coloring books scattered across the floor. Johnny spotted a blanket and wrapped it around Maggie's shoulders. "You're safe now," he assured her, settling her onto the worn couch. "I've got some friends who are really good at finding people. We'll find your mom." Johnny pulled out his phone, his thick fingers moving quickly across the screen. Within minutes, the quiet street came alive with the rumble of motorcycles. 2 bikes pulled up outside. Charlie, a silver-haired biker with kind eyes, and Dino, whose massive frame barely fit on his Harley. When they entered the house, both men instinctively softened their usual tough demeanors. Charlie especially seemed affected by Maggie, his eyes growing distant for a moment, as if seeing someone else's face in hers. "Little one needs our help," Johnny explained, keeping his voice steady for Maggie's benefit. "Her mama Rita didn't come home last night." Charlie nodded, understanding filling his weathered face. "We'll find her, Bear." He turned to Maggie with a gentle smile. "Your mom's got the whole cavalry looking for her now, sweetie." Dino was already on his phone, making calls to other chapter members. The Brotherhood was mobilizing, spreading out across town like a web. "Mrs. Peterson next door," Johnny said to Charlie. "She's watched Maggie before. Let's see if she can stay with her while we search." After settling Maggie with the elderly neighbor, who fussed over her with warm milk and cookies, the 3 bikers began their search. They split up, working their way through the snow-covered streets, questioning anyone they could find. Most people hurried past, intimidated by their appearance, but a few stopped to talk. An old man walking his dog remembered seeing Rita's red car the night before. A teenager recalled her leaving work at the diner around 6. The breakthrough came from Mrs. Martinez, who lived across from the Blue Moon Bar. She was sweeping snow from her front steps when Johnny approached. "Rita?" she said, wringing her hands nervously. "Yes, I saw her last night. She was leaving the Blue Moon, but—" Mrs. Martinez glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "She wasn't alone. That awful Hank Carson was with her." Johnny's jaw tightened. He knew Hank by reputation, a man whose violent temper was as legendary as his connections to local officials. "What time was this?" Johnny asked, keeping his voice calm despite the anger building inside him. "Must have been close to midnight," Mrs. Martinez replied. "She didn't look like she wanted to go with him, but you know how he is." Johnny nodded grimly and signaled to Charlie and Dino. They regrouped by their bikes, frost collecting on their leather jackets. "Blue Moon's our next stop," Johnny said, his voice hard with determination. "If Hank's involved, we need to move fast." The 3 men mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life in the quiet morning air. As they pulled away from the curb, leaving tracks in the fresh snow, Johnny couldn't shake the image of little Maggie in her pajamas, waiting for a mother who never came home. The Blue Moon Bar stood quiet in the morning light, its neon sign dark and lifeless. Johnny pushed open the heavy wooden door, letting Charlie and Dino follow him inside. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes hung in the air, mixing with the lingering memories of last night's crowd. A few early regulars hunched over their drinks at the far end of the bar, while the bartender, Mike, wiped down glasses with mechanical precision. His movements slowed when he saw the 3 bikers approach, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. "We're not looking for trouble," Johnny said, his voice low but firm. He leaned against the bar, making sure Mike could see the concern in his eyes rather than threat. "Just need some information about last night." Mike's cloth moved in slower circles across the glass. "Lot of people come through here. Can't keep track of everyone." "Rita Collins," Johnny said, "and Hank Carson." The name Hank made Mike's hand pause. He set the glass down carefully, as if it might shatter at any moment. Yeah, they were here. Hank was in one of his moods, drinking whiskey like it was water. Johnny exchanged glances with Charlie and Dino. They spread out naturally, Charlie drifting toward the regulars, while Dino positioned himself near the door. "Tell me everything you remember," Johnny pressed, sliding a folded bill across the bar. Mike pocketed the money with practiced ease. "Hank showed up around 9, already half drunk. Started running his mouth about Rita, saying she owed him something. When she came in later for her shift—" "Her shift?" Johnny interrupted. "Yeah, she picks up bartending hours sometimes. Anyway, Hank wouldn't leave her alone. Kept getting in her face, following her around the bar." A man at the end of the bar shifted in his seat, drawing Johnny's attention. The man wore a wrinkled business shirt, his tie loose around his neck. He looked like he hadn't left since the night before. Johnny moved down the bar toward him. The man stared into his nearly empty glass, as if hoping to find answers in its depths. "You were here last night," Johnny said. It wasn't a question. The man nodded slowly. "Tom Wheeler," he introduced himself, voice rough from too many cigarettes. "I was sitting right here when it all went down." "Tell me." Tom took a shaky breath. "Hank was wild, man. I've seen him mad before, but this was different. He kept yelling at Rita about some money she supposedly took from him, said she'd regret crossing him." Johnny's hands tightened into fists. "What time did they leave?" "Around midnight. Rita tried to slip out the back, but Hank caught up to her in the parking lot. Last I saw, he was forcing her into his truck." Before Johnny could ask another question, Dino gave a low whistle from his position by the door. Through the grimy windows, they could see a patrol car crawling past the bar, moving slower than necessary. Sheriff Andrews sat behind the wheel, his cold eyes scanning the parked motorcycles. The sheriff was well known in town, and not for his dedication to justice. Everyone knew he looked the other way whenever Hank caused trouble, their arrangement as obvious as it was corrupt. The patrol car lingered for a moment longer before continuing down the street, its message clear. They were being watched. Johnny straightened up, nodding his thanks to Tom. The three bikers moved toward the exit, their boots echoing in the quiet bar. They had what they came for, confirmation that Rita was in real danger, and that finding her wouldn't be as simple as they'd hoped. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Johnny led his crew through the quiet town. Their motorcycles rumbled softly, a sound that usually made people nervous, but today it felt more like a prayer. Charlie and Dino flanked him, while two other riders, Pete and Marcus, brought up the rear. Johnny's eyes scanned every alley, every doorway, looking for any sign of Hank's distinctive blue pickup truck. The streets were mostly empty, with just a few early risers hurrying about their business, clutching coffee cups and avoiding eye contact with the bikers. "Hold up," Charlie called out suddenly, his voice carrying over the engine noise. Johnny slowed his bike, following Charlie's gaze. There, parked in front of the imposing brick building that housed the mayor's office, sat Hank's truck. The blue paint was dulled by road dust, but there was no mistaking the dented rear fender and the custom chrome grille. They pulled their bikes into a nearby lot, killing the engines. The sudden silence felt heavy with tension. "What's he doing at the mayor's office this early?" Dino wondered aloud, removing his helmet. Johnny studied the building, noting the drawn blinds and the single light burning in an upper window despite the morning sun. "Nothing good," he muttered. Charlie moved closer to Johnny, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "You know, I've been hearing things about Hank for years. Man's got his fingers in everything around here." "What kind of things?" Johnny asked, though he had a feeling he already knew. Charlie ran a hand through his graying hair, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mayor Thompson's been in office for 15 years, right? Word is, Hank helped make that happen. Keeps helping it happen, if you know what I mean." Johnny nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. The way certain businesses always got their permits approved while others struggled. How some people's problems disappeared while others festered. The pattern was there if you knew where to look. Sheriff Andrews, too, Charlie continued, his voice bitter. Remember last summer when Hank got into that fight at the county fair? Deputies showed up, took statements, but nothing ever came of it. Report probably got lost in a drawer somewhere. The other bikers gathered closer, forming a tight circle. Pete, who'd grown up in town, spoke up. My cousin works at the courthouse, says Hank's name comes up in all sorts of cases, but he never seems to face consequences. Johnny thought about little Maggie, waiting back at the safe house with Marcus's wife. He thought about Rita, somewhere out there, probably scared and hurt. The weight of what they were up against settled over him like a heavy blanket. So we're not just dealing with Hank, Dino said, stating what they were all thinking. We're taking on the whole damn system. Charlie nodded grimly. Mayor, sheriff, probably half the city council. They're all in Hank's pocket. Or maybe he's in theirs. Hard to tell where the rot starts and ends in this town. The group fell silent, each man wrestling with the implications. What had started as a search for a missing woman had suddenly become something much larger and more dangerous. They weren't just going up against one violent man anymore. They were challenging the very power structure of the town itself. Johnny watched as a sleek black car pulled up to the mayor's office, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. The driver got out, straightened his expensive suit, and hurried inside without a glance in their direction. Just another piece of the corrupt puzzle they were facing. The old house creaked as Johnny and his crew made their way inside. The living room was small but tidy, with worn furniture that had seen better days. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the faded carpet where Maggie sat playing with her stuffed bear. Marcus's wife, Sarah, looked up from her spot on the couch, where she'd been watching over Maggie. She's been good, she said softly. Just keeps asking for her mama. Johnny nodded, his heart heavy. He watched as Maggie carefully arranged some wooden blocks in front of her bear, talking to it in whispers only she could understand. She looked so small, so defenseless against the harsh realities surrounding her. Thanks, Sarah, Johnny said. You can head home now if you want. We'll take it from here. The others spread out through the house, speaking in low voices about what they'd learned downtown. Charlie headed to the kitchen to make some coffee, while Dino took up position near the window, keeping watch. Johnny lowered himself to the floor near Maggie, careful not to disturb her play area. His large frame seemed out of place among the tiny blocks and stuffed animals, but he moved with surprising gentleness. Hey there, sweetheart, he said softly. Can I play with you for a bit? Maggie looked up at him with those big brown eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than a 2-year-old should have. She nodded and handed him a red block. That's real nice of you, Johnny said, turning the block in his rough hands. You know, Maggie, I was wondering if you could help me with something. Do you remember what happened last night, when your mommy went out? Maggie stacked another block on top of her growing tower. Mommy said be good, she mumbled. Said stay with Ms. Peterson next door. Johnny nodded encouragingly. That's right. And did you stay with Ms. Peterson? Until bedtime, Maggie said, her little face scrunching up in concentration. Then Mommy was supposed to come back, but she didn't. Johnny watched as she hugged her bear closer to her chest. Did you hear anything last night? Maybe voices or sounds outside? Maggie's lower lip trembled slightly. She stopped playing with the blocks and focused entirely on her bear, running her small fingers through its matted fur. The silence stretched for a moment, heavy with unspoken words. Car was loud, she finally said. Heard Mommy crying. Johnny's chest tightened. He shared a quick glance with Dino, who had moved closer to listen. What else do you remember, honey? Maggie's voice got even quieter, almost a whisper. Mommy's scared. She heard yelling. She clutched her bear tighter, her knuckles white against the brown fur. Hank made her cry. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking and heavy. Johnny felt something cold settle in his stomach as he watched Maggie return to methodically stacking her blocks, as if speaking those words had drained her of energy. The implications of what she'd said hit him like a physical blow. Rita wasn't just missing, she was with Hank, and she was terrified. The image of her crying, at the mercy of that violent man, made his hands clench into fists. The winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky as Johnny and Charlie cruised down the streets of the rougher side of town. Their motorcycles rumbled through narrow alleys where broken windows stared out like hollow eyes. The other bikers had split up to cover more ground. Marcus and Dino headed downtown, while Pete and Buck took the residential areas. Johnny pulled up beside a graffiti-covered wall, his boots crunching on broken glass. Charlie parked next to him, killing his engine. The silence felt heavy after the roar of their bikes. "You really think we'll find anything here?" Charlie asked, his breath visible in the cold air. Johnny adjusted his leather jacket. "Someone's got to know something. Hank's the type who likes to show off his power, especially in places like this." They walked past boarded-up storefronts and empty lots filled with weeds pushing through cracked concrete. A group of teenagers scattered as they approached, their sneakers squeaking against the wet pavement. "Remember when we used to run these streets?" Charlie said, his voice low. He rubbed his hands together for warmth. Johnny nodded. "Yeah, before we figured out there was more to life than causing trouble." They stopped at Joe's Corner Store, a dingy place with cigarette ads plastered across its windows. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed, casting a sickly glow over the dusty shelves. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, shook his head before they even asked their question. "Haven't seen him," he muttered, going back to his newspaper. Back on the street, they continued their search. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of burning trash from somewhere nearby. A dog barked in the distance. "We're running out of daylight," Charlie said, checking his watch. They approached another intersection where several food carts were set up. The smell of grilled meat and onions filled the air. An old woman stirred a pot of soup while a younger man flipped burgers on a flat-top grill. Johnny was about to walk past when he noticed the vendor's eyes following them. The man seemed nervous, his movements becoming jerky and uncertain. "Everything all right?" Johnny asked, stopping at the cart. The vendor glanced around before leaning forward. "I heard you asking about Hank," he said quietly. His accent was thick, but his words were clear. "The man with the mean eyes?" Charlie moved closer, shielding their conversation from view. "You've seen him?" "Last night. Very late." The vendor wiped his hands on his apron. "He drove past here. His truck was making noise. The muffler, it's broken. You can hear it from far away." Johnny's pulse quickened. "Where was he headed?" "To the old warehouse district." The vendor pointed east. "The abandoned one, where the paper factory used to be. Nobody goes there anymore, except people who don't want to be found." Charlie and Johnny exchanged looks. They knew the place, a sprawling complex of empty buildings on the outskirts of town, forgotten when the factory shut down years ago. "You sure about this?" Johnny asked. The vendor nodded. "My cousin works security nearby. He said Hank's truck has been there before. Many times." Johnny pulled out his wallet, but the vendor waved it away. "No money, just—" He hesitated. "Be careful. That man, he is dangerous." Johnny and Charlie walked back to their bikes, their steps quick but measured. The warehouse district was isolated, perfect for someone who wanted to keep things hidden. It made sense. Too much sense. "Could be a trap," Charlie said as they mounted their motorcycles. Johnny's expression was grim as he started his engine. Could be exactly what we're looking for. The abandoned paper factory loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like jagged teeth in a concrete skull. Johnny killed his motorcycle's engine, and the sudden silence felt oppressive. Charlie and 3 other bikers, Marcus, Dino, and Buck, pulled up beside him, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The warehouse complex sprawled across several acres, a maze of deteriorating buildings and rusty equipment. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls, carrying the musty smell of decay. Chunks of ice crunched under their boots as they dismounted. "Place gives me the creeps," Dino muttered, zipping up his leather jacket against the cold. Johnny surveyed the area, his experienced eyes picking out possible escape routes and danger spots. "Marcus, Buck, circle around back. Make sure there's no surprise visitors." The 2 men nodded and disappeared into the shadows. Charlie pulled out a flashlight, its beam dancing across graffiti-covered walls. "Hank's truck's here somewhere. Vendor said we'd hear that busted muffler." They moved cautiously through the yard, past abandoned loading docks and overturned dumpsters. Broken glass crunched beneath their feet, and somewhere in the darkness, metal creaked and groaned in the wind. "There," Dino whispered, pointing to a dark shape near the main building. It was Hank's pickup truck, its chrome dulled by a layer of frost. Johnny touched the hood. It was cold. "Been here a while," he said quietly. He noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirty snow leading to a side entrance. Someone else had arrived recently. Charlie drew closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "Could be walking into anything here, Bear. Hank's got friends in high places." "Yeah," Johnny agreed, checking his phone. No signal. Of course. He pulled his leather gloves tighter and flexed his fingers. "That's why we stick together. No hero moves." They gathered near the entrance, a rusted metal door hanging slightly ajar. The wind carried the sound of voices from somewhere inside. Faint, but definitely human. Johnny gestured for silence as they listened. Dino pulled out his brass knuckles, the metal glinting dully in the fading light. Charlie had a length of chain wrapped around his fist. They weren't looking for a fight, but they weren't stupid either. Not with Hank involved. Marcus and Buck rejoined them, moving like shadows. "2 more vehicles around back," Marcus reported in a hushed voice. "Sheriff's personal car and some fancy SUV. Looks like the mayor's." Johnny felt his jaw tighten. This was bigger than they'd thought. The corruption ran deeper than just Hank and his thugs. The whole system was rotten. As they prepared to enter, Johnny's mind drifted back to little Maggie, standing alone in that doorway. Her small voice echoed in his memory. "Mommy's not safe." The words hit differently now, here in the gathering darkness. They weren't just the fears of a frightened child. They were a warning. He thought about Rita, trapped somewhere in this concrete maze with the worst kinds of men. About Maggie waiting for her mother to come home. About how many times this town had looked the other way while people like Hank did whatever they wanted. Johnny pulled a heavy flashlight from his jacket, the kind that could double as a weapon if needed. His voice was barely above a whisper as he addressed his crew. "Whatever we find in there, whatever happens, we finish this. For Maggie." The others nodded grimly. They understood what was at stake. The wind howled through the broken windows above them, carrying the promise of snow. The warehouse air hung heavy with dust and darkness. Johnny led the way through the maze of abandoned machinery, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. Dim light filtered through broken windows high above, casting strange shadows across rusted conveyor belts and forgotten equipment. Charlie moved silently to Johnny's right, while Dino and Buck spread out behind them. Marcus stayed near the entrance, watching their backs. They'd done this dance before, but tonight felt different. The stakes were higher. A muffled sound caught Johnny's attention, voices coming from somewhere ahead. He held up his hand, and the group froze. The voices grew clearer as they crept forward, following a narrow corridor between tall stacks of rotting wooden pallets. The corridor opened into what must have been an old office area. Light spilled from beneath a door at the end of the hall. Actual electric light, not flashlights. Someone had jury-rigged power to this section of the building. As they drew closer, they could make out voices more clearly. Hank's distinctive growl carried through the thin walls, followed by a softer sound, a woman's frightened whimper. Johnny's jaw clenched. Rita. The door wasn't completely closed. Through the gap, Johnny could see into a small room that might have once been a supervisor's office. Rita sat tied to a metal chair, her face bruised and tear-stained. Her usually neat brown hair was tangled, and her lip was split. Hank towered over her, his massive frame blocking most of the weak fluorescent light. "Nobody's coming for you," Hank was saying, his voice thick with cruel amusement. "Your little girl? Probably frozen solid by now." Rita's eyes flashed with anger through her fear. "If you've touched her—" Hank's laugh cut through the air like a knife. "You're not really in a position to make threats, sweetheart." Johnny signaled to his men, positioning them carefully. Charlie and Buck moved to flank the doorway, while Dino stayed back, ready to block any escape attempt. Taking a deep breath, Johnny stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly in the silence. Hank spun around, his face twisting into an ugly sneer when he saw who it was. "Well, well, if it ain't the neighborhood hero." His hand moved toward his jacket pocket. "Let her go, Hank." Johnny's voice was steady, controlled. He took another step into the room, positioning himself between Hank and Rita. "Or what?" Hank's grin widened, showing too many teeth. "You gonna run crying to your biker buddies? Oh wait, they're already here." He gestured lazily towards the doorway where Charlie and Buck stood. "Brought the whole circus, didn't you?" Johnny moved closer, his boots crunching on broken glass. "Last chance. Untie her and walk away." Hank threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the bare walls. "You don't get it, do you? This ain't your business. This is between me and my girl here." He reached toward Rita, who flinched away from his touch. Johnny's patience snapped. He lunged forward, hands reaching for Hank's throat. Suddenly, Rita's scream pierced the air, high, terrified, and desperate. Everyone in the room froze, the sound hanging between them like a physical thing. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across their faces as they stood locked in that moment of suspended violence. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Hank's twisted face. His hand moved swiftly, pulling a gleaming hunting knife from his jacket pocket. The blade caught the light, sharp and deadly. "Back off," Hank snarled, waving the knife between Johnny and Rita. "Or I'll make sure she never sees that kid again." Johnny's heart hammered in his chest. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to move, to protect Rita, but the knife's edge kept him rooted in place. He could feel Charlie and Buck tensing behind him, ready to spring into action. Rita sat perfectly still in her chair, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Her eyes met Johnny's, wide with terror, but also something else. A silent plea for help. A tear rolled down her bruised cheek. "You really think you can get away with this?" Johnny's voice was low and steady, despite the fear churning in his gut. "The whole town's looking for her." Hank barked out a harsh laugh. "The town?" He took a step closer to Rita, pressing the knife against her shoulder. "You mean the sheriff who owes me favors? Or maybe the mayor who's in my pocket?" Rita whimpered as the knife's point dimpled her shirt. Johnny's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white with strain. The room felt too small, too hot, despite the winter chill seeping through the walls. "That little girl needs her mother," Johnny said, trying to keep his voice calm. Maggie's face flashed in his mind, her innocent eyes, her trust in him to make things right. "Think about what you're doing, Hank. Don't you dare talk about the kid." Hank's face flushed red with rage. He jabbed the knife closer to Rita's throat. "You think you can just walk in here playing hero? This ain't your business, Bear." The nickname came out like a curse. Johnny watched Hank's eyes dart between him and the door, calculating his chances. Behind him, Charlie shifted his weight, a subtle movement that made the floorboards creak. "It became my business when you left a 2-year-old alone in the cold," Johnny growled. The memory of finding Maggie at the door, shivering in her pajamas, made his blood boil. Hank's lips pulled back in a sneer. "Always trying to save everyone, aren't you? Well, not this time." He took a menacing step toward Johnny, the knife now pointed at his chest. Suddenly, the deep rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through the tension. The sound grew louder, echoing off the warehouse walls. More bikes joined in, their combined roar like rolling thunder. Hank's head snapped toward the sound. His grip on the knife faltered for just a split second. But it was enough. Johnny moved with the speed of a striking snake. His hand shot out, catching Hank's wrist in an iron grip. He twisted hard, forcing the knife away from Rita. Hank howled in pain and surprise as the weapon clattered to the floor, spinning away into a dark corner. Charlie and Buck surged forward, ready to help, while Rita stared at the scene unfolding before her, hope finally breaking through the fear in her eyes. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Charlie and Buck grabbed Rita's arms, helping her to her feet while Johnny kept Hank pinned against the wall. Her legs wobbled as she tried to stand, weak from being tied up for so long. "Get her out of here," Johnny shouted, his muscles straining against Hank's desperate struggles. The sound of car engines revving outside made everyone freeze. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow, getting closer to the warehouse entrance. "You're all dead," Hank spat, blood trickling from his split lip. "My boys are here now." Johnny slammed Hank hard against the wall one last time, then shoved him aside. "Move," he yelled to his crew. Charlie and Buck half-carried Rita between them, racing toward the back exit where their bikes waited. The warehouse door burst open. 3 burly men rushed in, their faces twisted with anger. Johnny sprinted after his crew, his boots pounding against the concrete floor. Outside, the bitter cold hit them like a wall. Snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the beam of their motorcycle headlights. Charlie helped Rita onto his bike, while Buck and Johnny mounted theirs. "Hold on tight," Charlie told Rita. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her fingers clutching his leather jacket. The bikes roared to life just as Hank and his men burst through the back door. Johnny led the way, his tires spinning in the fresh snow before finding grip. They shot forward into the darkness, leaving trails of kicked-up snow in their wake. Truck engines growled behind them. Headlights flooded the alley with harsh light. Johnny weaved between parked cars, leading them onto the main street. The trucks followed, their engines screaming as they gave chase. "Split up," Johnny's voice carried over the wind. He veered left while Charlie and Rita went right. Buck continued straight ahead, drawing one of the trucks after him. Rita pressed her face against Charlie's back, her tears freezing on her cheeks as they sped through the empty streets. Snow stung their faces like tiny needles. Behind them, a truck's tires squealed as it took the corner too fast, sliding sideways before recovering. Johnny cut through a narrow alley, barely wide enough for his bike. His pursuer was forced to find another route. The snow made the riding treacherous. Every turn was a calculated risk, every straightaway a chance for their pursuers to gain ground. Charlie and Rita emerged onto Pine Street, the fresh powder making the bike fishtail. Rita's grip tightened as Charlie fought to keep control. The truck behind them was getting closer, its bright lights filling their mirrors. They rounded another corner, and there was Johnny, waiting at the intersection. He fell in beside them as they roared past. Together they headed for the old lumber mill road, a twisting path through the woods that no truck could navigate at speed. The pursuing vehicles fell behind as the bikers threaded their way through the trees. Snow-laden branches whipped past them in the darkness. Finally, the sound of engines faded, replaced by the muffled quiet of the snowy night. When they were sure they weren't being followed, they regrouped on a side street. Buck joined them minutes later, his face red from the cold, but wearing a satisfied grin. "Everyone okay?" Johnny asked, scanning his crew and Rita for injuries. Rita nodded, though she was shaking, from cold or fear, or both. A bruise was darkening on her cheek, and her wrists were raw from the ropes, but she was alive. "We need to get back to Maggie," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Johnny nodded grimly. "Let's go. We're not safe out here." They started their bikes again, heading toward Johnny's place where Dino was watching over Maggie. The snow continued to fall, slowly covering their tracks as they disappeared into the night. Rita sat on Johnny's worn leather couch, her arms wrapped tightly around Maggie. The little girl hadn't stopped crying since seeing her mother's bruised face. Every few minutes, she'd touch Rita's cheek with gentle fingers, then burst into fresh tears. "It's okay, baby," Rita whispered, stroking Maggie's hair. "Mommy's here now." In the kitchen, Johnny moved quietly, making coffee and speaking in hushed tones on his phone. The other bikers had positioned themselves around the house, Charlie watching the front, Buck patrolling the back, and Dino keeping an eye on the street from his bike. The coffee maker gurgled, and Johnny poured 2 steaming cups. He brought one to Rita, setting it carefully on the side table. "It's not much, but it'll help warm you up." Rita nodded her thanks, but her hands were shaking too much to reach for the cup. Maggie had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep against her chest, exhausted from crying. "We need to get you both somewhere safe," Johnny said, keeping his voice low. "I've got a friend with a cabin up north. Nobody knows about it." Rita's eyes filled with fresh tears. "He'll find us," she whispered. "He always does." Johnny pulled up a chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Tell me," he said gently. Rita took a shaky breath. "The first time I tried to leave, I went to my sister's in Ohio. I thought I was being careful, but—" She swallowed hard. "He showed up at her door 3 days later. Said if I ever tried to run again, he'd hurt Maggie." Johnny's jaw clenched, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "The second time, I made it to California. Changed my name, got a job at a diner." Rita's voice cracked. 6 months later, one of his friends walked in during my shift. Said Hank sent his regards. She pulled Maggie closer. "I came back because I was afraid of what he'd do if I didn't." "How long has this been going on?" Johnny asked, his voice rough with anger. "Since before Maggie was born," Rita admitted. He has people everywhere. Police, politicians, business owners. They all owe him favors or they're scared of him. There's nowhere in this town he can't reach." Johnny reached out slowly, giving Rita time to pull away, and placed his hand over hers. "That stops now," he said firmly. "My crew and I were not afraid of him." Rita shook her head. "You don't understand. He'll hurt you too. He'll hurt anyone who tries to help me." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I can't let anyone else get hurt because of me." "Listen to me," Johnny said, leaning closer. My boys and we've dealt with men like Hank before. We know how to disappear, how to stay off the grid. We can protect you both." Maggie stirred in her sleep, whimpering softly. Rita soothed her with gentle touches, but her eyes were filled with doubt when she looked at Johnny. "I want to believe you," she said softly. "But Hank, he's not just some thug. He's got real power in this town, and he never forgets a grudge." She touched her bruised cheek unconsciously. "He'll never stop looking for us." Johnny squeezed her hand gently. "Then we'll make sure he never finds you. I promise." Rita pulled her hand away, fear clouding her eyes. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she whispered. I can't risk Maggie's safety. Not again." Johnny gathered his most trusted men in the garage behind his house. The space smelled of motor oil and leather, their motorcycles lined up against one wall like silent sentinels. Charlie leaned against his bike, arms crossed, while Buck and Dino sat on wooden crates, their faces grim. "Hank's got eyes everywhere," Johnny said, pacing the concrete floor. "We need to move Rita and Maggie tonight, but we've got to be smart about it." Charlie rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "My cousin's got that hunting cabin up in Cedar Falls. It's remote, hard to find unless you know where to look." "Too obvious," Buck cut in. "First place they'll check is family connections." Johnny nodded, his boots scuffing against the floor as he turned. "We need something unexpected. Somewhere Hank would never think to look." "What about Mary's place?" Dino suggested quietly. All eyes turned to him. "My sister's shelter for abused women. It's 3 towns over, has security, and they're used to keeping women hidden from dangerous men." "Would she take them?" Johnny asked. Dino nodded. "Mary owes me one. Plus she's got experience dealing with cases like this. They've got protocols, safe houses that even the police don't know about." "The police?" Charlie spat. "Half of them are in Hank's pocket anyway." Johnny stopped pacing, his face darkening. "Which is exactly why we need to get them out of here fast. You saw what he did to Rita. Next time could be worse. Or he could go after the kid," Buck added grimly. The words hung heavy in the air. Johnny's fists clenched at his sides. The thought of Hank anywhere near Maggie made his blood boil. "We'll need a diversion," Charlie said. "Make Hank think they're heading one way while we take them another." Johnny was about to respond when the garage door creaked open. They all turned, tensing, but it was just little Maggie in her pink pajamas, clutching her stuffed bear. She'd obviously woken up from her nap. "Hey, sweetheart," Johnny said softly, his voice completely different from the hard tone he'd been using moments before. "Does your mama know you're out here?" Maggie shook her head, taking tiny steps toward him. The other bikers watched in amazement as their tough leader knelt down to her level, his face softening. "She's sleeping," Maggie said, her small voice echoing in the garage. "I didn't want to wake her up." "That's good," Johnny said. "Your mama needs her rest." Maggie came closer, looking up at him with those big, innocent eyes that seemed to see right through his tough exterior. She reached out and touched his tattooed arm with her tiny fingers. "Johnny?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you my daddy?" The garage went absolutely silent. Johnny felt like someone had punched him in the gut. The other bikers stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Johnny stared at the little girl, her face so open and trusting, and felt something shift deep inside him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He'd faced down rival gangs, dealt with dangerous men, but this simple question from a 2-year-old had him completely blindsided. In that moment, looking into Maggie's hopeful eyes, all his carefully laid plans and tough guy persona crumbled away. Johnny sat with Maggie on the worn leather couch in his living room, her small frame curled against his side. Her stuffed bear was tucked safely in her arms, and her eyes were heavy with exhaustion from the day's events. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. "Want to hear a story?" Johnny asked, his gruff voice gentler than usual. Maggie nodded, snuggling closer. "Once there was a knight," Johnny began, surprising himself with the words that came naturally. "He wasn't like other knights. He didn't have fancy armor or a white horse. Instead, he rode a big black motorcycle." Maggie's eyes widened with interest. "Like yours?" "Just like mine," Johnny smiled, running his calloused hand over her soft hair. This knight spent a lot of time alone, thinking he wasn't good enough to help anyone. But one day he met a princess and her little girl who needed his help. "Were there bad guys?" Maggie whispered, clutching her bear tighter. Johnny paused, choosing his words carefully. "There were people who weren't being nice, but the knight promised to keep the princess and her daughter safe, no matter what." "Was he scared?" The question hit Johnny hard. He looked down at Maggie's innocent face and felt his throat tighten. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do what's right even when you are scared." Maggie seemed to consider this, her small fingers playing with the bear's worn ear. "Like Mommy was brave?" "Yeah, sweetheart. Just like your mommy." Johnny's voice cracked slightly. "Your mommy is one of the bravest people I've ever met." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Johnny looked at his tattooed arms, at the rough hands that had seen so many fights, and wondered if they could ever be gentle enough to help raise a child. The thought terrified him more than any confrontation he'd ever faced. "The knight in the story," he continued softly. "He learned something important. He learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is love someone and keep them safe." Maggie's eyes were getting heavier, but she fought to stay awake. "Did they live happy ever after?" Before Johnny could answer, he heard footsteps and looked up to see Charlie standing in the doorway. His old friend's face was etched with concern and understanding. "Hey, little one," Charlie said quietly. "I think it's time for you to get some rest." Maggie nodded sleepily, and Johnny helped her lie down on the couch, covering her with a soft blanket. Within moments, her breathing became deep and regular. Charlie waited until they were a few steps away before speaking. "You're good with her, Johnny." Johnny shook his head, doubt clouding his features. "I don't know what I'm doing, Charlie. I'm not cut out for this. My hands, they've done too many wrong things." "This isn't just about saving Rita anymore," Charlie said, his voice firm but kind. "That little girl deserves to grow up without looking over her shoulder, without jumping at shadows. She deserves to know what it feels like to be safe." Johnny looked back at Maggie's sleeping form, so small and vulnerable on his oversized couch. He thought about all the times he'd seen fear in children's eyes when they looked at him. But Maggie, she looked at him like he was her hero. Charlie placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes the people who think they deserve it the least are the ones who make the best protectors." Johnny nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the responsibility he'd taken on. It wasn't just about keeping them safe for a few days or weeks. It was about changing the course of a little girl's life. The abandoned strip mall loomed ahead, a shadow against the darkening sky. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth, and faded signs hung crooked above empty storefronts. Johnny led his crew through the crumbling parking lot, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. "Charlie, take the left," Johnny whispered, gesturing to a boarded-up convenience store. "Dino, cover the back exit. Rest of you, stay close." They'd tracked Hank here, after getting a tip from one of their contacts. Johnny's fists clenched as he thought of Rita and Maggie waiting back at the safe house. He hadn't wanted to leave them, but this might be their only chance to end things with Hank for good. The bikers moved silently through the shadows, years of experience making them quick and quiet despite their size. Johnny's heart pounded as they approached the old pharmacy where they'd seen movement earlier. Through the grimy windows, they spotted Hank pacing inside, talking on his phone. Johnny signaled to his men, and they prepared to move in. The door creaked as Johnny pushed it open. Hank spun around, his face twisting into an ugly smile. Well, well, if it isn't the knight in shining leather. It's over, Hank, Johnny growled. You're going to leave Rita and Maggie alone. Hank laughed, the sound echoing off the empty walls. You really think I came here alone? Suddenly, figures emerged from the darkness behind shelves and counters. Johnny's stomach dropped as he counted at least 10 men, all armed with various weapons. They'd walked right into a trap. Now, Hank shouted, and his men charged forward. The pharmacy erupted into chaos. Charlie tackled 2 men trying to flank them, while Dino swung a chain at another attacker. Johnny squared off against Hank, who had produced a metal pipe from behind his back. You should have stayed out of this, Hank snarled, swinging the pipe. Johnny barely dodged, feeling the wind from the near miss. The sounds of fighting filled the air, grunts, impacts, and the crash of bodies against old shelving units. Johnny managed to land a solid punch to Hank's jaw, but then something hard struck him from behind. He stumbled, turning to see one of Hank's men had circled around. Johnny! Charlie shouted in warning, but it was too late. The pipe caught Johnny in the ribs, sending shooting pain through his side. He gasped, struggling to stay on his feet. More of Hank's men poured in from the back entrance. The bikers found themselves surrounded, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Blood trickled from a cut above Johnny's eye, blurring his vision. Fall back! Johnny commanded, realizing they were losing ground. Everyone out, now! The bikers began retreating, covering each other as they moved toward the exit. Charlie helped support Johnny, who was clutching his injured side. Hank's laughter followed them as they stumbled out into the parking lot. You can't protect them forever, Hank called after them. This town belongs to me. They made it to their bikes, engines roaring to life in the darkness. Johnny winced as he mounted his motorcycle, each breath sending sharp pains through his chest. As they sped away from the strip mall, he knew they'd been outmaneuvered. They'd need a new plan, something Hank wouldn't expect. The cold wind stung Johnny's face as they rode through the night, the taste of defeat bitter in his mouth. Behind them, Hank's men emerged from the strip mall, their victorious shouts fading into the distance. The rumble of motorcycles faded as Johnny and his crew pulled up to his house. The porch light cast a warm glow across their battered faces. Johnny winced as he dismounted, his ribs screaming in protest. Charlie rushed to help him, but Johnny waved him off. I'm fine, he muttered, though the way he held his side told a different story. Inside, Rita paced the living room floor. When she saw their condition, her hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, what happened? Her eyes locked onto Johnny's injuries, the blood on his jacket, the bruises forming on his face. Maggie sat on the floor with her stuffed bear, looking up at them with wide eyes. Johnny got hurt? She asked in her small voice. Johnny tried to smile for her, but it came out as more of a grimace. Just a few scratches, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about. Rita hurried to the kitchen and came back with a first aid kit. As she helped clean the cut above Johnny's eye, her hands trembled. This is all my fault, she whispered. If I hadn't gotten involved with Hank in the first place— Don't, Johnny said firmly. None of this is your fault. Hank's the one who chose to be violent. He's the one who won't let go. Charlie and the other bikers settled into various spots around the living room, their usual boisterous energy subdued by the night's defeat. Dino nursed a split lip, while another biker, Mike, held an ice pack to his swollen knee. There were too many of them, Charlie explained to Rita. Hank had it all planned out. Must have been watching us, waiting for us to make a move. Rita's face paled. If he knew you were coming there, what if he knows where we are now? Maggie looked up from her bear, sensing her mother's fear. She crawled over to Johnny and climbed into his lap, careful not to touch his injured side. The simple trust in her action made Johnny's throat tight. We need to leave, Rita said, starting to pace again. Maybe if we go somewhere far away, somewhere he can't find us. Running won't solve anything, Johnny said quietly. Hank won't stop. He'll keep looking, keep hurting people until he gets what he wants. He gently stroked Maggie's hair as she leaned against his chest. We have to end this. Rita stopped pacing and turned to face him. But how? You saw what happened tonight. He's got too many men, too much influence in this town. Johnny looked around at his crew, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. These men weren't just fellow bikers anymore. They were family. And family protected their own. Rita, he said, his voice steady despite the pain in his ribs. I made a promise to keep you and Maggie safe. That's not changing no matter what Hank throws at us. He shifted Maggie in his lap so he could look at her face. You hear that, little one? Nobody's going to hurt you or your mommy, not while I'm around. Charlie stood up, his expression determined. Not while any of us are around. The other bikers nodded in agreement. Rita's eyes filled with tears. Why would you all risk so much for us? Because it's the right thing to do, Johnny said simply. He turned to his crew. Hank thinks he won tonight, but he's wrong. We're not finished, not by a long shot. The bikers gathered closer, their determination replacing their earlier defeat. As they began discussing strategies and plans, Johnny held Maggie close, watching Rita's worried face slowly relax. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning sun filtered through Johnny's kitchen window as he and his crew gathered around the worn wooden table. Coffee cups steamed in front of them, untouched as they focused on the task at hand. Maps and notes covered every inch of the table's surface. The mayor's annual speech is tomorrow, Charlie said, pointing to a circled date on the calendar. Everyone in town will be there. It's our best shot at exposing Hank. Johnny nodded, his ribs still aching from the previous night's fight. We've got evidence of his deals with the corrupt officials, photos, recordings, everything. He spread out several photographs showing Hank with the mayor and Sheriff Andrews in compromising situations. Rita sat at the far end of the table, her fingers wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. But what if something goes wrong? What if he won't, Johnny interrupted gently. Not with the whole town watching. Dino, sporting a fresh black eye, leaned forward. I've got guys stationed at every exit of the town square. The moment Hank shows up, we'll know. In the living room, Maggie played with her stuffed bear, humming softly to herself. The sight of her innocent play strengthened Johnny's resolve. Here's how it's going down, Johnny said, pulling out a detailed sketch of the town square. The speech starts at noon. Mayor Williams always makes a big show of it, letting everyone see what a fine, upstanding citizen he is. His voice dripped with sarcasm. Charlie traced the routes on the map with his finger. We'll have 3 groups. First group takes position here, by the courthouse steps. Second group covers the side streets. Third group. He glanced at Johnny. We'll be right in front of the podium. Rita's face paled. Right in front of Hank? He needs to see us, Johnny explained. Needs to know we're not backing down. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. And when the mayor starts talking about the town's bright future, that's when we make our move. The bikers nodded, their faces grim but determined. They'd been through countless fights before. But this was different. This wasn't about territory or respect. It was about protecting a mother and her child from a monster. "What about Maggie?" Rita asked, watching her daughter through the doorway. "She can't be anywhere near this." "Already taken care of," Johnny assured her. "Mrs. Peterson from the diner agreed to watch her. She'll be safe." The crew spent the next hour going over every detail of the plan. They mapped escape routes, synchronized watches, and memorized their positions. Each man knew his role by heart. "Remember," Johnny said, his voice low and serious, "we're not looking for a fight. This is about justice, about showing the town who Hank really is." He looked each of his men in the eye. "But if he makes a move?" "We'll be ready," Charlie finished. They gathered their evidence and started preparing their bikes. The rumble of engines filled the morning air as test runs were made, fuel tanks topped off. No detail could be overlooked. Rita watched from the porch as the bikers moved with military precision. Johnny joined her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "you and Maggie will be free of him. For good." Inside, Maggie's sweet voice carried through the open window as she sang to her bear, reminding them all of exactly what they were fighting for. The crew mounted their bikes for one final practice run through town. As they rode out, the weight of tomorrow's confrontation settled over them like a heavy cloud. Everything they'd worked for would come down to one moment, one chance to end Hank's reign of terror, once and for all. The town square buzzed with activity as people gathered for the mayor's annual speech. American flags fluttered in the breeze, and red, white, and blue bunting draped the makeshift stage. The whole scene looked like a picture-perfect small-town gathering, but tension crackled beneath the surface. Johnny and his crew rolled in on their bikes, the rumble of engines drawing every eye their way. They were dressed in their cleanest leather vests, patches gleaming in the midday sun. Charlie flanked Johnny's right while Dino took the left, their faces set with grim determination. "There he is," Charlie muttered, nodding towards the stage. Hank stood near the podium, wearing a pressed suit that couldn't hide the brutality in his eyes. He was surrounded by his usual group of yes-men, all of them trying to look important in their ill-fitting clothes. Mayor Williams stood nearby, nervously adjusting his tie. The bikers positioned themselves according to plan. Some melted into the crowd, while others took their places near the exits. Johnny's heart pounded, but his steps were steady as he approached the stage. Sheriff Andrews appeared, his badge catching the sunlight. He whispered something to Hank, who smirked and shook his head. The sight made Johnny's blood boil, but he kept his cool. They had to play this smart. The mayor cleared his throat and stepped up to the microphone. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "Welcome to our annual town address." Johnny reached into his vest pocket, feeling the envelope of evidence. Photos of secret meetings, records of bribes, testimonies from people Hank had terrorized. It was all there. Hank spotted Johnny moving closer to the stage. His smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something darker. He whispered to one of his men, who immediately started moving through the crowd. The mayor droned on about progress and community spirit, each word ringing hollow in Johnny's ears. He thought of Rita and Maggie, safely hidden away at Mrs. Peterson's house. This was for them. Johnny stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden steps of the stage. Charlie and Dino moved with him, a wall of leather and determination. "Excuse me, Mayor Williams." Johnny's voice cut through the speech. The crowd fell silent. "I think it's time the people heard the truth about what's really happening in our town." Hank's face twisted with rage. He started forward, but froze when he saw several of Johnny's men emerge from the crowd. Johnny pulled out the envelope. "I have proof of corruption right here. Proof of how this man," he pointed at Hank, "has been running this town through fear and violence, with help from those sworn to protect us." The crowd stirred. Whispers rippled through the gathering as Johnny held up the first photograph, Hank and the mayor making a shadowy exchange behind the courthouse. "This town has been living under a shadow," Johnny continued, his voice growing stronger. "While good people like Rita Morrison live in fear, men like Hank Carson walk free because they've bought their way out of justice." More photos came out. The sheriff accepting envelopes of cash, the mayor looking the other way while Hank's men threatened local business owners. Each image drew more gasps from the crowd. Hank's face had turned an ugly shade of red. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snarled, but his voice shook. "I think I do," Johnny replied calmly. "And so does everyone else now." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. People pointed and stared, the truth finally laying bare before them. Mayor Williams had backed away from the podium, his face ashen. Hank looked around, seeing the turning tide. With a curse that echoed across the square, he shoved his way through the crowd and stormed off, his men scrambling to follow. Mayor Williams stumbled back to the microphone, tugging at his collar. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool spring air. Now, he said, forcing a smile. "Let's not jump to conclusions. These photos could be taken out of context." Sheriff Andrews pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on his gun belt. "That's right," he drawled. "You can't trust a bunch of bikers. They're probably doctored photos." But the damage was done. The crowd pressed forward, faces twisted with anger and disbelief. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store pointed a trembling finger at the stage. "My husband and I paid protection money for years," she shouted. "Everyone knew, but nobody helped us." More voices joined in. Tom Baker, who owned the hardware store, stepped forward. "Hank's men broke my windows when I refused to sell him my property. The sheriff said there wasn't enough evidence." Johnny stood firm on the stage, letting the truth wash over the crowd. Charlie and Dino flanked him, their presence steady and sure. Through the sea of angry faces, he spotted Hank's black truck peeling out of the parking lot, tires squealing on the pavement. "He's running," someone yelled. The sheriff raised his hands, trying to calm the growing storm. "Now listen here, folks. This is all just a misunderstanding. Mr. Carson is a respected businessman." "A respected criminal," interrupted Frank Wilson, whose daughter had dated Hank briefly before disappearing to another state. "You took his money while he terrorized our kids." The crowd surged forward. The mayor backed away, nearly tripping over his own feet. Sheriff Andrews reached for his gun, but several of Johnny's men stepped closer, their faces hard. "I wouldn't do that, Sheriff," Johnny said quietly. His voice carried across the square. "These people have had enough." More townspeople were coming forward now, years of fear and anger finally breaking free. Sarah Thompson, the high school teacher, climbed onto the stage. "My brother tried to report Hank's drug dealing 3 years ago," she announced, her voice shaking. "The next day, he lost his job. The day after that, his house mysteriously caught fire. Sheriff Andrews called it an accident." The sheriff's face had gone pale. He looked around wildly, but there was nowhere to run. The crowd had formed a circle around the stage, and their voices were getting louder. "Arrest him! What about the mayor? We want justice!" The chants grew stronger. Even some of the deputies standing at the edges of the crowd began to look uncertain. One of them pulled out his phone, presumably calling the state police. Mayor Williams slumped in his chair, all pretense of authority gone. But Sheriff Andrews wasn't done. He stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full height. "Now you listen here," he growled. "Hank Carson brought jobs to this town. He kept the economy going when times were tough. You people should be grateful." The crowd's roar drowned out his words. Years of pent-up fury and resentment exploded. People surged forward, their faces set with determination. Some held up their phones, recording everything. Others shouted their own stories of Hank's cruelty and the sheriff's willful blindness. "We want our town back! No more corruption! Lock them up!" The tide had turned, and there was no stopping it now. The people of the town, silent for so long, had finally found their voice. The crowd gradually dispersed as state police cars rolled into the town square, their lights flashing against the storefronts. Johnny stood on the edge of the chaos, watching as officers led Sheriff Andrews away in handcuffs. The mayor had already been escorted out, his head bowed in shame. Rita sat on a nearby bench, holding Maggie close. The little girl was dozing, her stuffed bear clutched tightly to her chest. The morning's events had worn everyone out, but there was a lightness in the air, like the whole town could finally breathe again. Johnny walked over and sat down beside them, wincing slightly from his earlier injuries. "You okay?" he asked softly, careful not to wake Maggie. Rita nodded, her eyes wet with tears. "I never thought—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "I never thought anyone would stand up to them like that. Not for me, not for us." "Everyone deserves to feel safe," Johnny said, watching as more townspeople came forward to give statements to the state police. "This town's been under Hank's thumb for too long." Charlie approached them, his leather vest dusty from the morning's confrontation. "State boys say they've got roadblocks up. Hank won't get far." He gave Rita a reassuring nod before heading back to the other bikers. Rita shifted Maggie in her arms, the little girl stirring slightly before settling back to sleep. "I don't know how to thank you, Johnny. You and your men, you risked everything." "No need for thanks," Johnny replied, his voice gruff with emotion. He looked at Maggie's peaceful face, remembering her innocent question from days before. "Are you my daddy?" The words had struck something deep inside him, awakening feelings he thought he'd buried long ago. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, watching Rita's face. "This town's gonna be different now. With Hank gone, with the corruption exposed, it could be a good place to raise a kid." Rita tensed slightly, her arms tightening around Maggie. "Johnny, just hear me out," he continued, turning to face her fully. "I know you've been hurt. I know you're scared. But you've got friends here now. The whole town saw what happened. They'll look out for you both." The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light across the square. In the distance, the bikers were helping some townspeople clean up the aftermath of the confrontation, working together like they'd been neighbors all their lives. "You could start fresh," Johnny said. "Get a job, find a place of your own. Maggie could go to school here, make friends." He paused, his heart pounding. "And I'd be around, to help, if you wanted." Rita looked down at her sleeping daughter, then out at the town square where people were already beginning to rebuild. Mrs. Chen was sweeping her storefront, chatting with one of Johnny's bikers. Tom Baker was putting up a new open sign in his hardware store window. "I don't know," Rita whispered, but there was uncertainty in her voice, rather than fear. "Starting over? It's not easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Johnny replied, "but you wouldn't be alone this time." Rita was quiet for a long moment, running her fingers through Maggie's hair. Finally, she looked up at Johnny, really looked at him, seeing past the tattoos and the leather to the man who had risked everything to protect her daughter. "Okay," she said softly, a small smile breaking through her tears. "We'll stay." Spring arrived in gentle waves, bringing with it new beginnings. The old diner on Main Street, once abandoned and dusty, now buzzed with life. Johnny had helped Rita secure a job there as a waitress, and the owner, Mrs. Peterson, had taken an immediate liking to both her and Maggie. The morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows as Rita balanced plates of pancakes and eggs. Johnny sat at the counter, pretending to read his newspaper while keeping a watchful eye on Maggie, who colored in a book at a nearby booth. "More coffee?" Rita asked, already pouring before Johnny could answer. Her smile came easier these days, the shadows under her eyes fading with each peaceful night's sleep. "Thanks," Johnny said, watching as Maggie's crayon moved carefully within the lines. "She's getting better at that. She practices every day." Rita's voice softened with pride. "The daycare says she's their best artist." The daycare had been Johnny's idea. He'd found a good one just 2 blocks from the diner, run by a retired teacher who treated every child like her own grandkid. At first, Rita had been hesitant to let Maggie out of her sight, but seeing her daughter bloom among other children had eased her fears. After her shift ended, Rita hung up her apron while Johnny helped Maggie pack up her crayons. The 3 of them had fallen into an easy routine: breakfast at the diner, Maggie to daycare, Rita to work, and Johnny splitting his time between his garage and keeping an eye on them both. "The park?" Maggie asked hopefully, tugging on Johnny's leather jacket. Even in the warmer weather, he couldn't bring himself to leave it behind. "Sure thing, Princess," Johnny replied, his gruff voice gentler than anyone would have thought possible a few months ago. Rita nodded her approval, and they headed out together. The park was quiet this time of day. Johnny sat on a bench, watching as Maggie climbed the jungle gym. Rita settled beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "She's different now," Rita said softly. "Happier, more confident." Johnny nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He remembered the frightened little girl shivering in her doorway that snowy morning. Now she waved from the top of the slide, her laugh carrying across the playground. "You're different too," he said, glancing at Rita. She smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. The fear that had haunted her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. Maggie ran over to them, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Push me on the swings!" she demanded, grabbing Johnny's hand. He let her pull him to his feet, following her to the swing set. As he pushed her gently, her giggles filled the air. Each push was careful, measured. The same hands that had once fought battles now dedicated to keeping a little girl safe and happy. "Higher!" Maggie squealed, and Johnny obliged, but not too high. He'd learned the delicate balance of giving her freedom while keeping her protected. As the swing slowed, Maggie looked over her shoulder at him. Her eyes, bright and trusting, met his. "Johnny?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. "Yeah, sweetheart? Are you my daddy?" The world seemed to pause. Johnny's hands stilled on the swing chains, his heart thundering in his chest. He looked over at Rita, who watched them with tears in her eyes, and then back at Maggie's hopeful face. His voice thick with emotion, Johnny nodded. "Yeah," he managed to say. "Yeah, I guess I am." The old Baker Street diner had seen better days. Its faded sign hung crooked, and the windows were covered in years of grime. But Johnny saw potential in the worn-down building, just as he'd seen potential in himself months ago. "Are you sure about this?" Rita asked, standing beside him on the cracked sidewalk. She held Maggie's hand, who was fascinated by the rusty bell above the door. "Charlie used to be a contractor before joining the crew," Johnny explained, his voice confident. "And Dino's got experience in restaurant work. We can do this." As if on cue, the rumble of motorcycles filled the street. The familiar faces of Johnny's crew pulled up, parking their bikes in a neat row. Charlie jumped off first, already pulling work gloves from his back pocket. "Ready to get started, boss?" he asked, examining the building's facade with a professional eye. Over the next few weeks, the diner transformed. The bikers worked tirelessly, their leather vests covered in sawdust and paint. Local folks who'd once crossed the street to avoid them now stopped to watch, curiosity replacing fear. Rita proved to be a natural at planning the menu, drawing from memories of her grandmother's cooking. Maggie helped by testing every flavor of milkshake they considered, her face often smeared with chocolate or strawberry. "The counter needs to be lower here," Johnny pointed out one afternoon, gesturing to a section near the register, "so Maggie can see over it." Rita smiled at his thoughtfulness. The tough biker who'd first walked into their lives had softened, though his protective nature remained as strong as ever. The crew worked through summer's heat, replacing broken tiles and fixing ancient plumbing. Old Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop next door began bringing them lemonade, and Mr. Parker from the hardware store offered them discounted supplies. Inside, the diner took shape. Clean white walls replaced the yellowed wallpaper, and the chrome fixtures gleamed. The red vinyl booths, carefully restored by Dino's skilled hands, invited people to sit and stay a while. Maggie insisted on helping arrange the candy display, her small hands carefully placing lollipops in rainbow order. Johnny lifted her up so she could reach the top shelf, her giggles echoing through the nearly finished space. The morning of the opening arrived crisp and clear. Rita stood behind the counter in a fresh apron, nervously adjusting salt shakers. The bikers had traded their usual leather for clean white t-shirts, though they'd kept their vests. "Ready?" Johnny asked, his hand on the door's lock. Rita nodded, and he flipped the sign to "Open." At first, the street remained quiet. Then Mrs. Henderson appeared, bringing a potted plant for good luck. Mr. Parker followed with his entire family. Soon, the bells above the door chimed steadily as curious townspeople filtered in. Outside, Maggie played hopscotch on the newly swept sidewalk, supervised by Charlie and a few other bikers. She'd drawn the squares herself with pink chalk, insisting that pink made everything better. Johnny stood in the doorway, watching his unlikely family at work. Rita moved confidently between tables, chatting with customers who'd become neighbors. The bikers served plates of food with surprising grace, their genuine smiles replacing their once intimidating scowls. Through the window, he could see Maggie teaching some local kids her hopscotch rules, her face bright with joy. She caught his eye and waved, shouting, "Daddy, look!" as she completed a perfect jump. The word still hit him like a physical force, filling his chest with warmth. Johnny waved back, overwhelmed by how much his life had changed. Where once he'd found purpose in chaos, he now found it in morning pancakes and pink chalk hopscotch. Johnny walked down Main Street, his boots clicking against the familiar sidewalk. The morning sun cast long shadows, and shop owners waved as they opened their businesses. It felt strange, being greeted with smiles instead of fearful glances. He paused outside Thompson's grocery, remembering how just months ago, Old Man Thompson would rush to lock the door whenever he saw bikers approaching. Now, a "Protected by Hell's Angels" sticker proudly decorated the store window, a symbol of trust earned through actions, not intimidation. The weight of his leather vest felt different these days. The patches that once marked him as an outlaw now represented something else entirely. Children no longer crossed the street to avoid him. Instead, they'd wave and call out, "Hi, Maggie's dad!" The title still made his heart skip a beat. Outside the library, Mrs. Peterson was setting up for story time. She caught his eye and smiled warmly. "Johnny, will Maggie be joining us today?" "Rita's bringing her after breakfast," he replied, still amazed at how natural these ordinary conversations had become. Just last week, he'd sat through an entire reading of The Three Little Pigs, surrounded by toddlers who seemed more fascinated by his tattoos than scared of them. As he walked past the police station, Deputy Williams nodded respectfully. The new sheriff had worked closely with Johnny's crew to clean up the corruption Hank had left behind. It was a strange partnership, but it worked. Charlie's motorcycle rumbled up beside him. "Morning, boss," he called out, parking his bike. Thinking deep thoughts? Johnny chuckled. Just remembering how things used to be. Remember when we'd ride through here looking for trouble? Yeah, Charlie nodded, falling into step beside him. Now we're organizing bake sales and neighborhood watches. Who'd have thought? They passed the spot where they'd once had a brutal fight with a rival gang. Now it was a small park, with flowers planted by the community garden club, including some of their own crew members. Big Mike, their former enforcer, had discovered a passion for growing roses. The sound of laughter drew their attention to the diner. Through the window, Johnny could see Rita teaching some of the younger bikers how to properly flip pancakes. Maggie sat at the counter, her legs swinging, watching the lesson with delight. More motorcycles rumbled down the street, the morning shift arriving for breakfast before their patrol. The crew had divided the town into sectors, each group responsible for keeping their area safe, not through violence or fear, but through presence and protection. People gathered on the sidewalks, setting up tables for the town's monthly community breakfast. The event had started small, just the diner offering free coffee to anyone willing to sit down and talk about making the town better. Now it had grown into something bigger, something that brought everyone together. Johnny watched as his crew helped set up chairs, their leather vests glinting in the morning sun. Some wore new patches, ones that marked achievements in community service rather than bar fights. The respect they'd earned felt real, solid in a way their old reputation never had. The town square filled with people, shopkeepers, families, bikers, and police officers, all mingling together. Children darted between tables, their parents unafraid. The barrier between us and them had dissolved, replaced by a sense of community Johnny had never thought possible. Standing there, watching it all, Johnny felt decades of tension release from his shoulders. The anger that had driven him for so long, the need to prove himself through force. It all seemed to belong to another lifetime. Here, now, he had found something real, something worth protecting. The evening settled softly over their small house on Oak Street, bringing with it the kind of peace Johnny had only dreamed about in his wilder days. Through the window, snow fell in gentle flakes, coating the world in pristine white. Inside, the fireplace crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls of their cozy living room. Rita sat curled up on the worn leather armchair, her feet tucked beneath her, holding a steaming mug of hot chocolate. Her eyes were bright and clear now, free from the haunted look that had shadowed them for so long. Maggie lay on her stomach on the plush rug, coloring with intense concentration, her tongue sticking out slightly as she worked. Johnny watched them both from his spot on the couch, still amazed at how naturally they had become a family. The house wasn't fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom with creaky floorboards and dated wallpaper. But it was theirs. Pictures lined the walls, Maggie's first day at preschool, Rita's graduation from cooking school, the grand opening of their diner. "Daddy, look!" Maggie held up her drawing proudly. It showed 3 stick figures standing in front of what appeared to be their diner. One figure wore a leather vest covered in scribbled patches, while another had long yellow hair. The smallest figure stood between them, holding both their hands. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Johnny said, his voice rough with emotion. He never got tired of hearing her call him Daddy. Rita set down her mug and moved to sit beside him on the couch. "She's got your artistic touch," she teased, nudging his shoulder. "Remember those horrible designs you wanted to paint on the diner's walls?" "Hey now," Johnny protested, laughing. "Those flames would have looked great." "The flowers we chose are much better," Rita replied firmly, but her eyes sparkled with amusement. Maggie scrambled up onto the couch between them, clutching her drawing. "Can we put it on the fridge at the diner?" she asked hopefully. "Next to my other ones?" "Of course we can, baby," Rita assured her, smoothing back Maggie's dark curls. "Right next to the one of Daddy and his motorcycle." Johnny wrapped an arm around both of them, drawing them close. The warmth from the fire seemed to seep into his bones, chasing away the last lingering chill of his past. "You know what?" he said softly. "I was thinking maybe this summer we could take a real vacation. The three of us. Maybe head down to the beach?" Rita's eyes widened. "Really? What about the diner?" "Charlie and the guys can handle it for a week," Johnny said. "They've been asking to prove they can run things without us anyway." He looked down at Maggie. "What do you think, Princess? Want to build some sandcastles?" Maggie bounced excitedly. "Can we? Can we really?" "We really can," Johnny assured her. "And maybe—" He glanced at Rita, suddenly nervous. "Maybe after that we could talk about making this family official? All of it?" Rita's breath caught, understanding his meaning immediately. Her eyes filled with happy tears as she nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the town had grown quiet under its blanket of snow. Through the window they could see the glow of warm lights from neighboring houses, each one representing another family, another story of hope and renewal. The street where drug deals once took place now hosted block parties. The corner where fights broke out was now home to a thriving farmer's market. Maggie wriggled free from their embrace and ran to the window, pressing her nose against the cold glass. "Look! It's snowing harder!" She spun around, her face glowing with excitement. "Daddy, come see." Johnny stood, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He scooped Maggie up in his arms as she squealed with delight. Together, they watched the snow fall, while Rita looked on, her heart full of love for her little family. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, casting long shadows across Main Street. Johnny stood in front of the diner, his hands in his pockets, taking in the familiar sight of the weathered sign that read, "Bear's Family Diner." The chrome trim gleamed in the fading light, and the windows reflected the warm glow from inside, where the last few customers of the day were finishing their meals. He remembered the day they'd opened, how nervous Rita had been about the first batch of pies, how his hands had shaken while counting out change. Now, after months of hard work, the diner had become the heart of the community. The morning regulars knew their coffee orders by heart, and kids stopped by after school for Rita's famous chocolate chip cookies. The leather of his vest creaked as he shifted his weight, softer now from daily wear. The patches that had once marked him as an outsider told a different story these days. Local children would point excitedly when they saw him, calling out, "Mr. Bear," as he passed. The thought made him smile. Charlie walked out of the diner, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Another good day, boss," he said, nodding towards the nearly empty parking lot. "Those new recipes Rita's been trying out, they're really bringing folks in." "She's got a gift," Johnny agreed, pride warming his voice. "Who would have thought, huh? A bunch of bikers running the most popular family spot in town?" Charlie chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Life's funny that way." He clapped Johnny on the shoulder before heading to his motorcycle. "See you tomorrow?" The bell above the door chimed, and Johnny turned to see Rita stepping out, Maggie's small hand clasped in hers. His daughter, and his heart still skipped a beat at that word, wore her favorite blue dress, the one with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem. Her dark curls bounced as she skipped down the steps. "Daddy!" she called out, breaking free from Rita to run toward him. "Can we get ice cream, please?" Johnny scooped her up, settling her on his hip with practiced ease. "Ice cream? After all those cookies you snuck from the kitchen today?" Maggie's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Daddy knows everything," Rita said, walking over to join them. She looked beautiful in the sunset light, her blonde hair catching the golden rays. The haunted look that had once shadowed her face was long gone, replaced by quiet confidence and joy. "Not everything," Johnny admitted, wrapping his free arm around Rita's waist. "Just enough to know that I'm the luckiest man alive." Rita leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We're all lucky," she said softly. "Look at what we built together." They stood there, the three of them, watching as the sun sank lower on the horizon. The street lamps flickered to life, one by one, casting pools of warm light on the sidewalk. In the distance, they could hear the familiar rumble of motorcycles, their extended family heading home after another day of keeping watch over the town they'd all grown to love. "Ready to head home?" Johnny asked, looking at his girls, his family. "Home," Maggie echoed happily, playing with one of the patches on his vest. Rita smiled up at him, her eyes shining with love and trust. "Let's go home." Together they walked down Main Street, their shadows merging into one long silhouette on the pavement. Johnny had become something he never thought possible: a father, a protector, a man worthy of the love these two remarkable souls gave him so freely. In their eyes, he had found his redemption. In their love, he had found his peace. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching.